What's up, everybody? Welcome to this episode of Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell. I am going solo today as my co host, Misty Winston, is busy with some family duties. But I'm happy to have back on the show again a frequent guest, Danny Sjursen. He's a former Army major. He is now an anti war activist. He's the author of several books, including Patriotic Dissent and a new one coming out in June called, I have it written down here, A True History of the United States. So keep an eye out for that. And he is also the co-host of Fortress on a Hill podcast. And we've been speaking with Danny lately about AFRICOM and U.S. and Western imperial adventures there. And we're going to continue that discussion today with a conversation on a little known imperial adventure that's taking shape via both the U.S. and other Western powers, and that's in Mozambique. So we're going to break that down today. Danny, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's Steve over at Slow News Day, like we said last time, is he can't take the heat. He's really going to be upset that I'm back on so soon. But I love coming on the show for a lot of reasons. We have fun, we have some laugh, but the fact that we're talking about Mozambique today, like specifically, is really unheard of. I mean, there aren't a lot of shows covering it. I did a spot with Scott Horton. He'll do that kind of stuff occasionally over on the libertarian side, but when you have a Democratic president, show me a mainstream lefty, like more than usual place that's going to really cover this, and I'd say that's unlikely.
I agree. So let's start with some background, because Mozambique has pretty much been colonized for 500 or so years now. Can we go back half a millennium and kind of work our way up to where we are now in a general sense?
I think it does matter. People often forget, when folks know imperialism at all, they normally think of the high age of imperialism. That usually means like 1870 to 1920, scramble for Africa, right when pretty much all of Africa got gobbled up. And they think of the British and the French. Well, the British and the French were the largest empires. True. But they weren't the first. In Africa, really, and most places. The interesting fact is that the Portuguese were the first and kind of the last colonizers for the most part. And in the classic sense of owning a place. So the Portuguese are, coming around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. I think it's like Vasco da Gama we're talking about here, right? Around 1498. And by 1500, they're starting to put little forts and trading posts on what was called the Swahili coast, which is Tanzania and northern Mozambique. Of course, that's where the big conflict we're going to be talking about today is northern Mozambique. But by 1505, it's an official colony, even though they only really own the coast. It's an official colony of Portugal, and it stays an official colony of Portugal until 1975. Now, I've said oftentimes that empires in decline behave badly. It's not great to be under the Portuguese or like the Belgians in the Congo, because the Portuguese and smaller countries like that, they were pretty much always in decline. They were always kind of weak. And so sometimes those more like tenuous places, they don't have the ability to co-opt or throw as much resources. So their colonies become more neglected. Hence millions dying in the Congo, right, under the Belgians. Mm-hmm. Same was kind of true in the Portuguese colonies to a certain extent. In 1966, a pretty massive uprising begins in all three of Portugal's main colonies that are left in Africa. That's Guinea-Bissau, Angola, which is pretty well known because of its tortured relationship with like apartheid South Africa and all that, and then the Cubans come in, and Mozambique. And Mozambique's like kind of forgotten today, but it wasn't back during the Cold War. It was considered like a hot spot. So from 1966 until 1975, there's a brutal war, maybe 50,000 civilians dead in it, lots of fighters on both sides, a guerrilla insurgency for freedom. I think I joke in the article, like the Portuguese lost their anti-freedom, fight, and that's what happened. Would that were the end of Mozambican colonization, right? Or neo-imperialism, or neo-colonial victimhood. Well, no, because this is the height of the Cold War. It's the height of its own like regional hot proxy war, because Southern Africa is different. Southern Africa is different from the rest of the continent. It's a unique spot. What's unique about Southern Africa is that you had two significant-ish, right, but large white minority populations. And that was mainly in South Africa, which had a lot of whites, maybe 20% of the population, give or take, at the height. Apartheid state, classic apartheid, right? And then you had Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, which borders Mozambique to the southeast, I believe, or directly. No. It's actually, it's like up, right? Because it's northeast. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They touch. So that was a small minority state. They called themselves Rhodesia. Brutal. I mean, in some ways, because they were a smaller white population, they had to like hold on tighter than even the South Africans. They had their own apartheid, unilaterally declared independence from the British in 1964, which was illegal, and had this white minority kind of pariah state that only got support from, you guessed it, South Africa, Israel, and somewhat surreptitiously the United States copper industry, and government, in terms of like protecting it a little bit. So Mozambique is considered leftist because the Frelimo rebel movement that still rules, right? Like in many post-colonial states, kind of one-party rule, in fact, automatic, right? Not perfect guys, but they were freedom fighters, and now the problem is that there are two other insurgencies happening in those white minority states. In Rhodesia, you've got two different groups. You've got Robert Mugabe, right, who's like famous for like becoming corrupt and brutal, and much of that is true, although he doesn't get a fair shake in his earlier life. That they're fighting against Rhodesia in the Rhodesian Bush War, an insurgency against the white minority. They eventually lose in 1980. But this is still 1975. So that insurgency is going on, and they're using Mozambique as a safe haven. And to some extent, Frelimo, as a pan-African leftist freedom movement that now is the party running Mozambique, is allowing some of this to happen. And some of it they just can't control. The weak state control functions borders. And then you've got the same thing can be said of the, Nelson Mandela, right? The UW, the armed wing of the ANC. They're getting some help from Mozambique. So what does this mean? It means that the white minority, brutal apartheid, racist regimes, in collusion with the American Central Intelligence Agency, because let's not forget that the historic direct and largely indirect backer of worldwide apartheid is the United States of America, because it had its own official apartheid until 1965, right? And then continues to have some sort of neo-apartheid. So the United States CIA, in conjunction, although led by the Rhodesian CIO, which is their CIA, and whatever South Africa was called, they basically raise a rebel army called Renamo, which is the opponent of Frelimo. And so, yeah, they're Mozambicans, right? But it's like the Contras to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
They unleash this army, basically, this rebel movement into Mozambique to try to like overthrow the Frelimo government, and then allow like South Africa and Rhodesia to stifle the rebels that are using Mozambique to fight for their freedom as a safe haven. And that war goes on from 1975 to 1991, and maybe 1 million people died. So the point is that that's all the lead up that is going to be necessary when we move into this conflict, but no one is reporting on. No one is reporting on this. And we talked before we started the show, like I just want to go. I mean, I can't stand like the Patriots. I'm a Giants fan, but it's like Belichick's rule, right? Like, do your job. Well, do your homework, reporters, like backstory, context. Not getting done. Why is that not getting done? Well, one, like they're lazy and no one wants to read, and also the readers don't want to read about it, and the editors don't want to publish it. But we don't really know what the readers would read because we don't even give them the option any longer. Mm-hmm. And also they've shut down their foreign bureaus in downsizing to an online model and an entertainment as media rather than, media as news format. And so most of these reporters, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, they're either reporting from their home bureaus in like Washington or New York, or they're in a safer regional but still very distant hub. So they may be in Nairobi, Kenya, or Durban or whatever in South Africa, or they may even be up in West Africa. I saw reporting from Senegal. Mm-hmm. And so the main media coverage has missed that backstory. And that's why I start with the article with the idea of, oh, yes, I'm sure the exact thing that Mozambicans average Mozambicans are excited to see is white faces upon their shores, because that hasn't ended well for 515 years. One of the longest colonized spots on the planet Earth. Crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it, in a dark humor way, reminds me of the Bill Hicks bit where he says, I think the last thing that Jesus would want to see if he came back to Earth was a cross. So
Right.
the Mozambicans have been
like trauma everywhere he goes.
yeah. As you just laid out, they've been colonized and um, subject to wars of various kinds for centuries. And as we talked about in previous episodes, the U.S. and other Western powers, including France, are making or trying to make inroads back into their former colonies. This sort of militaristic neo-colonialism that we highlighted last time, but it keeps expanding despite the fact that there seems to be no point, or there's a very vague mission involved. So now that the U.S. is expanding into Mozambique with a 12-man special forces team, can you talk about that and what you think, what the U.S. says is its motive, what the West says is its motive, and what the real motives are?
So the first thing I think that's worth noting here is that putting 12 Green Berets in a place sounds pretty basic. Like, it's not a big deal. The New York Times report on it said they described the mission as modest in size and scope.
Right.
And I just thought that was a bold move, because they said it very offhandedly without like a critical caveat afterwards, or like I feel like there should be like a ... but maybe, they don't really do that. Now, I think there's two problems with that. One, if you want to talk about like scope in a broader sense, the fact that there are U.S. troops in southern Africa, south of the Congo, is unprecedented. We've meddled down there. We've had CIA folks fooling around down there. But whereas U.S. troops, especially since the founding of AFRICOM in 2007 and 8, have been all over Africa, very few places and no regions besides Southern Africa have been off limits. That's just the one place we haven't put troops. Now, some people would say, well, there's no Muslims down there. That's something to think about, right? There's an element of not many, right? They are in northern Mozambique. And then the second thing is, that's a total misunderstanding of like what it is to put an A team, right? A Special Forces Operational Detachment Alpha into a country. It's not hard to find out, because despite the fact that they're very special, these special forces, mind you, there are now 70,000 special forces in, the U.S. military, which is double what they were before 9/11, even though the Army's same size, right? Basically, the military same size. That raises serious questions about how special they are. But that includes everybody, including like some of the support of the special forces who are technically land there. But the Green Berets, they are pretty special. They go through a really tough thing. A lot of my friends did that. They're not the sun faded hair surfer Navy SEAL image, all of them, but they're pretty special. That said, the reason it misunderstands it is because they could go on Google and read open source manuals, military manuals that describe what kind of assets they can bring to bear and what they typically do. Or they could just ask some soldiers. Like, they could do that, or ex-Green Berets, or serving ones, like even anonymous sources, right? Like on not on record.
But that would require work.
Yeah, they have to actually talk to humans, right? We don't do that any longer. But let's think about what that really means. Okay, so they have 12 specialized sergeants and then 10 specialized sergeants, 1 officer, and 1 warrant officer who's a second in command. But they bring a lot to bear. And the reason I say this is a foot in the door, that I sort of joke is going to get stuck in the door, is because they have those 12 guys, but they have an enormous amount of enablers. What does that look like? Okay, in my experience, and I've worked with these guys, I had a team, an A team on my base for like 3 months. They weren't exactly TACCON or tactical control to me, but they lived on my base. We worked together. Me and the captain, we were the same rank. We coordinated. I commanded 10 times more troops than him, but mine were younger usually and like conventional scouts. But like typical things that they take with them or they can call to bear in Afghanistan, just in terms of enablers, dog teams to sniff for bombs, joint tactical air controllers or joint terminal air controllers, guys who call air support. They're often Air Force, sometimes they're Army. Additional intelligence personnel, civil affairs personnel, medical support specialists. But that's people. What they really have that I was jealous of, that my soldiers were jealous of, and that I was really happy to have because they did work with me when I had a team with me, is they can bring surveillance, intelligence, air power, airstrikes, and money, cold hard cash, in higher volumes. They punch above their weight, in other words, and faster. And so it's just like a misunderstanding to think that this is a small thing. But I kind of answered a question that you didn't exactly ask, but just because you mentioned the A team, I think it's important. So, but why do it? Okay. I argue in the piece, and I really, really strongly am confident this is the case. There is a total myth and ruse being pulled on the American people about this, because what they're doing over there is technically something called the JCET, JCET, and or JCAT, I think they call it, right? I don't remember, but it doesn't matter. A Joint Combined Exchange Training. A JCAT, by the regulations, by the manual, and I don't mention this in the so much in the article. The training that they provide, right? The Joint Combined Exchange Training, because they're there to train the Mozambican Marines so that they can do better against these ISIS Africa, ISIS Central African Province, Mozambique, right. Element, which is
we haven't seen this before.
Right. Like, so perfect. Like I'll talk about that in a bit because it's like so ironic that the only people who benefit from branding these like local rebels as ISIS are like ISIS and Washington, like they're in on together or something. And I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way. It's just paradoxical and interesting and instructive. But by the regulations, a JCAT is specifically for the benefit of the American commandos, not like, in other words, by calling it that, the one of the main purposes is that we get a benefit out of like the practice of training you as much as you get a benefit. But like that's a lie. That's one lie. The second lie is that that this is about ISIS, that this is about a global caliphate, and that related to that, these local, what they call them al-Shabaab locally, which just means like the youth, basically, like the young Turks, like the franchise. Like, you know what I mean? Like the kids in Newark, that Martin Luther King said he couldn't completely, and it's different because these guys cut heads off and that wasn't really a thing in Newark. You know what I mean? I'm not saying they're good guys, but the point is the idea that they are linked real way to central ISIS, which is what any longer besides a media agency. They don't really hold much terrain. The physical caliphate's gone. That is a ruse put upon the world and the American people by ISIS, which benefits from it by being able to, since they've been kind of snuffed out in Iraq and Syria, their homeland in Mesopotamia, they're saying, no, we're still in the game. And one of the ways we're in the game is we got all these affiliates down in Africa that are doing way better. So it benefits them, but it benefits Washington because it provides the justification to endlessly expand an endless war. And so I think that, well, if that's not what it's for, then what is it? And I argue that it's about resource and Cold Wars. Resource and Cold Wars are directly related. Resource. Why does France care so much, and the United States to some extent, about Niger and Mali and all this? Well, we've talked about it on the show. That's where their uranium is, and that's what provides them their independent nuclear arsenal, which is what provides them their deterrent that makes them believe they're a world power. It's all linked. Well, there's got to be, something tells me that very poor Mozambicans, majority of whom are living in absolute poverty. I'm not sure how that's defined, but that's what they say in articles. I'm like, that sounds worse than regular poverty. I don't want to be absolutely poor.
I was thinking about that descriptor of poverty. Is there in absolute poverty.
Right? I don't know. Like, do we measure it on the Kelvin scale? Is it like minus 3 Kelvin? Do you get minus 273 calories? I mean, now we're getting dark.
I don't know. I think they have an app for that.
Yeah, I mean, I would download. If not, me and you need to do that. That's how we'll get our windfall, so we don't have to. We can write about anything we want. We don't
Yeah.
have money doing it. But so there's there's got to be resources. I was thinking under these Mozambican poor feet, there have to be resources, and of course, it's mostly offshore. And wouldn't you know, it's in the very part of Mozambique where this insurgency is happening, Cabo Delgado, which is the northeastern province, where two things exist. That's where the Muslims live. Right, that's where the portion of Mozambique that's Muslim. The rest of them are mostly Catholic, hence because of the Portuguese down south. And it's like 900 kilometers away, the capital, by the way. So it's distant, and they're just different people in a lot of ways. But the second thing is they got liquid natural gas. Maybe the most generous deposit in the world, but definitely up there. The array of countries that have investments there. The French corporation Total has the most. They've got the main big facility, $66 billion investment, the largest and richest LNG plant or refinery in the world is there, right off the coast, right there. And but there's other people who have there's a cornucopia of major foreign multinationals and foreign energy companies there. I mean, just the highlights are ExxonMobil and Chevron from the United States, BP from Britain, Eni from Italy, Mitsui from Japan, Petronas from Malaysia. I might be pronouncing this wrong, and wait for it, China's CNPC. So that's the link. So there's the resource. We gotta protect the liquid natural, gas, and which is mostly farmed out by Western or growing powerful East Asian companies, not Mozambicans, right? That's not who's benefiting from this. Like, have we heard this story before? Like, are we right back like Mozambique, Iran, 53? Like, it never changes, does it?
Yeah.
But the China element's important because I think what this also is about, and it's related, is this new Cold War myth that is being put upon us. So not only is there a new Cold War with Russia, which has been going on because apparently like Putin, me, you, and Trump are all like having cocktail parties over Zoom, like this idea, so Russia we know about, right? We know there's this new Cold War brewing. That was not even new any longer. And then China's really getting a lot of attention recently. China, of course, has the most economic investment, major trading partner of Africa. We then say that that's a threat to us somehow. Even though they only have one base in Africa that's military, we have 29 that we're sure of, and more than that. And 30 now, right? Because those Green Berets got to live somewhere. They'll call that non-permanent site. I forget what they call them. They call them like non-permanent. It's just like ridiculous. But
like the green zone.
Yeah, right. Like the city. That's why they called it the Emerald City in that book, right? But final point here is just like this idea that there's not only a two-front new Cold War that's like more expansive than the old Cold War, but that it has to be waged everywhere, including Mozambique. Like, it's wildly distant. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, it might actually be closer to China in this instance, but it is, I'm sure. But there's also been Russian mercenaries there, hired by Mozambique, by the government, the Wagner Group. They got their butts kicked, by the way, and lost some guys and have kind of retreated and been replaced. We'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But this is being written about as though it's a proxy battleground with like China and Russia. And what's it a proxy battleground for? Influence, but resources, liquid natural. I mean, it is the African cliche, or we should say, because I like alliteration, it is the African archetype for decency from the West and now East Asia. But we're worse. Yeah. We put troops there.
It's a modern militarized form of Heart of Darkness, I kept thinking when I was reading your piece. And I wanted to ask you, just going back a tiny bit, you just said that by invitation of the Mozambican government, I forget which entity you said was invited, but I wanted to ask you about JSET or JCET, which you mentioned earlier. Was that by invitation of the government as well?
Yeah, it is actually. Maputo, the capital, right? It's the Frelimo party that's there. We haven't discussed yet, and it's rarely covered except with like a sentence, and not covered in terms of our actions, right, in our interventions, is that the roots of this insurgency, and we can get more into it later, are old, and they're partly externally caused because the West destroyed Mozambique and tortured it even after independence for like 500 years. But a lot of it's just, these one-party sort of post-colonial states have their problems. I mean, they're poor to begin with, and then these parties become like, they go straight Animal Farm on us, and the pigs start wearing suits, walking on two legs. They're corrupt. They hoard the resources and money. The wealth disparity there is like off the charts. They, in terms of that, any of the liquid natural gas wealth that comes in is not going to the region where it's from. Same old story. And they're distant. They're like 900 kilometers away to the south. So the government is having trouble holding on to northern Mozambique. They can't solve it themselves. Their army's bad. There's a big like intra-army police jurisdiction squabble, massive human rights abuses by the security forces, which may be killing like as many people or close to it as the I like to call them Al-Shabaab because that's what the locals call them, but what Washington and, Raqqa in exile, ISIS calls ISIS CAP Mozambique. Like, talk about a mouthful. But
yeah, I wanted to hit on that too, because one of the things we often reference in our discussions is language and how it's used. And when I read that acronym and what it stands for, ISCAP, which is, you might know it by memory.
yeah, no,
I'm trying to look for it in your piece.
The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria - Central African Province, and then the State Department added to differentiate it from the other wing of what so ISIS Central calls this ISIS CAP, right? ISIS CAP. And it refers to two wings of that, which is the Al-Shabaab folks in Mozambique, but also this group called like doesn't matter, DNC or something. It's a Congo group. Also been lumped under there and agreed to like pledge allegiance and get nothing for it except media attention, really. So the State Department calls this ISIS. So I'm just going to read the whole thing. I'm going to say the whole thing out because you're talking about language. It's important. The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria - Central African Province - Mozambique. And like we've talked about, words matter so much. Think about the pack of lying punches that are like packed inside that acronym. The following things. Just by its existence, just by being put together with a hyphen, it implies that there is any meaningful, centrally directed Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. It implies that they have adherence to the same like ideology purposes of like globalized jihad, if that's even what ISIS was originally for, that are way down in Central Africa, Central African Province, even though it's not really Central Africa, it's more, they should call it Southern African Province, doesn't matter. And it implies that there's any real link between the two. And it implies that the Mozambican specific brand of it is as motivated or more by said central directed Iraq, Syria, one-time caliphate and its goals as by local concerns or local catalysts and grievances. All of that is packed in there. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous construct because the only people who tell us that there really is a connection are our intelligence agencies and State Department in Washington and ISIS. ISIS's media outlets, like they're like all the outlets that they have. The experts, even at think tanks I don't like, right? Even at some of the think tanks that are funded by the war. Now, some of them are saying terrible things that like parrot the party line in Washington. But in this is a rare case where even some of the think tanks that are like funded by the war industry and that I normally don't like their reports, even they are like forced to admit because they like pretend some sort of expertise and scholarly objectivity. Actually, no, there's not really any evidence that there's any real connection. financial training or other.
Right.
ISIS
Oth- Other
did,
than just making that pledge, as you said, that pledge of allegiance to ISIS, which yields them little more than maybe media attention.
and gives them maybe more credibility and power at home in terms of their mythology. Like America also branded
Right.
the leader of this group as a specially designated terrorist. SDT? Ooh. Like, wait for it, Jesse. You're going to be an SDT someday. Gotta be
Is
careful.
that Abu Yasir Hassan?
Yeah. And you know what's interesting about that? I'm like, has Washington not learned its lesson after like bin Laden, Zarqawi, and Baghdadi that like you end up making these guys into globalized legends?
Yeah.
And it's like man who shot Liberty Valance. Like you know, what if the legend's better than the truth? Like once the legend becomes truth, print the legend. It's like we're making these guys, and not just with the leaders, but by accepting this classification that ISIS did this. The fact that ISIS wants to say that they're connected, unless there's like massive proof that they are, my position is the U.S. government should be like, nope, refuse to play. I'm not lending any credence to this myth that
Right.
only benefits them. But instead, what we do is we support ISIS's rebranding efforts. Like we bless off on them. We're like, hey, we don't like you guys, and we're trying to kill you, but whatever you say out of your media, like we're good with it. And it's crazy. I think the language matters, and the we can talk about it, but not very little of this is tied to that external stuff. It's tied to a corrupt, poor, and resource hoarding, unevenly like one party rule. So party insiders benefit from the resources of the North. They deny it to the people in the North. There's a cultural chauvinism about religion and stuff because of Catholic, Muslim, and then this desperate government, because its own security forces are not effective, will turn to anybody for support. And so they tried Russians, that didn't work. We'll talk about it later, but they tried the South African mercenaries. After the Russian mercenaries didn't work, they're still there, by the way, throwing hand grenades out of helicopters into crowds, by the way, according to Amnesty International. We'll talk about that more. And now they'll turn to the United States for this Green Beret team, hoping, if we're honest, that that'll be a foot in the door, like I said, and there'll be more coming from the United States, money and resources. But now, guess who's back, right? Like what's that? Like it's like that rap song, like guess who's back? Guess who's back? The Portuguese. Like, are you serious right now? Like,
yeah. When I read that in your piece, I had to sit back and think, is this for real? Like,
yep.
After so many hundreds of years of colonialism and falling apart as an empire, you're really trying to do it all over again?
If they weren't murdering villagers and cutting off like children's heads, I'd be like, that would be enough where I'd be like, you know what, I might be on their side. Like, I mean, you know what I mean? I might be like, I hope the rebels do win. Like, if the central government that's 900 kilometers away is willing to bring back in the Portuguese 500-year colonists who waged brutal war on your people for that long, especially the last 10 years, it's unbelievable what they'll do. Anything is permissible when you're desperate and you want to hoard resources. So they'll turn to the West. And by the way, the French and the South Africans and the British are all reportedly, from serious media sources and anonymous sources within their militaries, all three of them are watching very carefully and considering sending troops in. So we could really have like a wretched reunion party of like former colonists and apartheidists, and I'm really glad America wants to be in on that game. What does that say about us? It's
Right.
like what it was, the Aesop's fable, like you are the company you keep, you know?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah, but even that statement right there, we're watching what happens and considering what we're going to do. I'm paraphrasing, but you're watching your own creation, what you're destroying and what's rising from that destruction, which is, like you said, the glorification of these people who really have no attachment to ISIS, Central, or however they want to dub themselves. And I think that again goes back to sort of not pointlessness, because we've talked about the resource extraction and probably wanting to plant a permanent footprint in Mozambique, but the again, like you said, the way it's described to us is, if we get any description at all, is so vague. And I think that in your piece, that exchange between John McDermott, who's the chief Africa correspondent for The Economist, and John T. Godfrey, who's his job description, or his job title, acting coordinator for counterterrorism and acting special envoy for the global coalition to defeat ISIS. That's a mouthful right there.
He's a lot of acting things. He's not officially a lot of stuff.
Yeah. And so last month there was a digital press briefing, you say, called U.S. Efforts to Combat Terrorism in Africa. Can you just break down that exchange? Because I think it's very telling as to the vagueness of what the U.S. is ostensibly trying to do in Mozambique, with lots of echoes of Vietnam when Kennedy was sending special advisors there.
Yeah. I read, funny, like, personal backstory. I read this report. I print out like lots of articles, like scores of articles a week, and I just go through them and I find what I want to write about next or whatever. And I was in LA for some work stuff like a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So I'm sitting in a Santa Monica, like $53 a plate of scrambled eggs brunch joint, for a meeting, and I'm just doing my reading. I'm alone, you know what I mean? And I read this report, and like I was laughing out loud like a crazy person, like in a crowded sort of, like, you know what I mean, and by myself. And I was like, man, like, this place is expensive, so they're probably like, man, he's either too rich or just rich enough to, like, be crazy, like, to be demented, because people must have thought I was nuts, And the reason it's so funny is because it's like my new favorite, like, passive aggressive but like principled question asking format. And like, of course, it had to be like a dry Brit who did it. Mm-hmm. Not that the press is great or anything always, and The Economist certainly isn't. But this is what he says. John McDermott, chief Africa correspondent for The Economist, says to Godfrey, he says, "Hi," this is how he leads off. "Hi, sorry if this is a naughty question." That tells me he knows he's not going to get an answer, and he also knows that he's going to get a lie or like an obfuscation, and that he already knows the answer that he's not going to get, which is the true one.
Yeah.
But what is the evidence of links between ISIS and the insurgents in Mozambique beyond the reported pledges of allegiance made more than 18 months ago? And of course, that's the real rub, isn't it, that we've been talking about? And then he said, what we talked about, he goes, and a related question, he's only supposed to ask one, but he goes, and a related question, but he's naughty, is what is the evidence that, Abu Yasser Hassan is the leader of the group, and what precisely do you mean by leader? Now, what's great is I feel like we should find a way to get McDermott on the show with us and just talk language for an hour. Because
that's a good idea.
He deconstructs the damn thing.
Yeah.
And clearly, by the way, McDermott knows something about Mozambique, because even the way he phrased it by saying the insurgents in Mozambique, like, he refused to play like this thing and just assume their title as being somehow, he didn't even say like allegedly affiliated. Like, he wouldn't even give it that. He's like, you need to show me. Now, the answer is amazing, though, because the answer is, it's the answer that has justified, it's the same answer we always get, and it's the answer that's justified a globalized war where you have, 80 countries with major military bases in them, right? 800 bases. I mean, it's the answer that allows the 9/11 AUMF, which we'll talk about in a bit, to be stretched so far to its actual breaking point. It's an absurd conclusion that to Mozambique. He said, one of the truisms, this is Godfrey, the acting, Führer of everything, or maybe I shouldn't have said Führer, but no, I stand by it. It's funny. He said, one of the sorts of truisms of doing counterterrorism work is that, unfortunately, a lot of the information that we rely on to inform our assessments isn't the kind of thing we can discuss publicly. And I was thinking, isn't that convenient? Yeah. He goes, this is my favorite, though. I love this. He says, but I would say, what would you say, Mr. Godfrey? I would say that the evidence of ties between the ISIS branch or network in Mozambique and the so-called ISIS core in Iraq and Syria is quite incontrovertible. So I wrote in the article, like, translation, we can't tell you, but, trust us. It's not as if we're proven pathological liars. And what I mean to say is, like, these aren't the droids you're looking for. I mean,
yeah,
amazing. It's an amazing turn of phrase. And like, oh man, I wonder if he would come on the show. Like, I imagine he has so much commentary. I imagine he went to the bar that night and just went ape shit to anyone and all the other reporters who like just want to get good paychecks and don't really care about principles, like starting to move away from him. And he was just being like, I want to be a real reporter. Like, what's wrong with you people? That was the most absurd thing, right? But look, that's the justification that allows this to happen is we can't tell you about threats to your security because they're threats to your security, but we need you to believe that they're threats to your security because that's what justifies us sending troops everywhere to protect your security. I mean, the whole thing is very catch-22.
Yeah, it's a tautology of sorts. And I also like his use of quite incontrovertible. Well, something's either incontrovertible or it isn't. There aren't really degrees. So
you see that caveat though, it tells me that like his time, even his like tainted and like so many compromises been made already. Tummy,
yeah,
feel good. It doesn't even. I don't think he knows he's doing it. It doesn't even feel good saying just incontrovertible because he knows something.
Right.
He's a dumb guy. He knows that it is very controvertible. You know what I mean?
Yeah. He reminds me, I don't know what he looks like, but just his words and the demeanor I can picture. He reminds me of that. I don't know what he would be called. I think he was like a CIA attaché in near the beginning of Apocalypse Now when Willard is called to the lunch and basically briefed on what he's going to have to do. There's that one guy that never talks, but he offers him a cigarette and just gives him these weird looks. I imagine that's what Godfrey's like.
In a short sleeve white button down because he's in the tropics, you know, and he's like sweating profusely and like eating that gross seafood at the table, you know.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know, I think this is a really key point. It's like it's a big guy, it's a big lie, and it's a long con. It's a big lie because it allows a more expansive global war than the United States and maybe any power. Well, no, definitely any power has ever fought in terms of its globalness, like its global expansiveness. And it's a long con because it's been going on at least since 9/11, right? So it's a 20-year long con. And the people who are in on it are the hawks in the Republican and Democratic Party establishment and the opportunistic, often horrifying in their actual actions, remaining ISIS rebels. That's who's in on it. What a great alliance, you know? I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah.
No one on this, by the way, like no one quoted that exchange to my knowledge in anywhere. Like no one wrote a whole story on that. I guess no one likes interesting news or like really instructive stuff.
I think it's a fascinating exchange. Not only McDermott's deconstruction, as we said, but the way Godfrey manipulates his answers. And if you just take any of his answers and sort of deconstruct them, he's really saying nothing at all, but it sounds convincing. And
McDermott jumps back in, and it's just fun for its petulance because, like, I'm a petulance like enthusiast and maybe an aficionado even. I'm like Hemingway with bullfights, except about petulance.
Yeah.
He jumps back in when they try to give it to this other reporter, and he goes, "I'm sorry, my second question about," and they were like, "No, sorry, we normally only have one," and he goes, "Yeah, but my first question wasn't actually answered either, so maybe I'll get half an answer to my second question."
Yeah.
Because he's the reason I said that is because that's what you said. He says a lot and he says nothing in that lot.
Right.
It's like protoplasm of nonsense with not even a kernel of substance in it. And this is what's been reported about Mozambique. It's uncritically accepted. It's like, there's only 12 of them. They haven't even gone to a baker's dozen yet. Like, it's no big deal. It's like it's a huge deal for American troops to be on, combat troops, killers, to be on the ground in Southern Africa in a semi-combat role, right? Like they're training for a conflict. They're not just down there putting together a hospital or responding to a hurricane. For the first time in I think history, and if I'm wrong about that, it's basically the first time, and it's nothing like this before.
Yeah, it's nothing I've heard of before. Of course, I've heard of the other Western conquests into Africa throughout history, but not much about Mozambique. And it's been interesting reading the history of the country because we don't learn about any of that in school unless perhaps you're focusing on Africa studies in college, but even then, and I think that's a big part of the problem with what's going on there too, is that it's so far away. It sounds even more exotic to Westerners, to Americans than Iraq, for instance, or Yemen, or Lebanon. It's like Mozambique. Most people can't even find it on a map and haven't heard of any of what we talked about going on down there. But add on to that what is happening down there and the lack of attachment to the ISIS core, as Godfrey calls them. I think what you call mission creep in your piece is that's what we're starting to see with these 12 special forces troops sent there. That's part of, I think, the overall mission creep that we've been seeing since shortly after 9/11, when the U.S. Started its war on Afghanistan, and then a few years later on Iraq. And this is, I think, mission creep building onto that. It's like this entity, this monster, this leviathan that doesn't know what to do but keep replicating itself across the planet, much to the detriment of people who live in the places they colonize and occupy.
About that, one of the other things that's not reported enough is like what's the legal justification? The fact, as I mentioned earlier, that the authorization for the use of military force, which was voted on in the House 3 days after the towers came down, September 14th, 2001, still smoldering. Literally, ground zero is not necessarily the best time to make a massive decision in the absence of quite incontrovertible evidence, right?
Yeah.
What does the AUMF say? It's been used all over the world. There's a list of the countries that have been used. It's like 25 countries plus the high seas. I love the high seas. Like, I don't really know a lot about the seas, but it sounds so important when you say high seas, especially if you like capitalize high. But it's okay. So it authorizes the president.
The Somali pirates of the high seas.
Right. Yeah, right. I love it. And then no one likes pirates, except everyone kind of does. But I don't know. Maybe I root for them, like Jack Sparrow. No, I'm kidding. Maybe I don't like any indecency. But so the AUMF was targeted specifically at, quote, those nations, organizations, or persons that the president determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks of 9/11 or harbored such organizations or persons. Well, that's been stretched and twisted so far now that apparently it permits military intervention against groups that weren't founded until 16 years, didn't conduct an attack until 16 years after 9/11 or that AMF, and then even the seed of this group, like the kind of religious movement that was kind of forming for a lot of reasons we can get into sometime. Even that didn't really pick up until 2007, so that's at least 6 years after it. So how in the world could they fit any of those categories to justify? But you know what? Don't worry, because A, no one really questions this. B, no one in Congress really wants to be in charge of declaring war, even though that's their duty under the Constitution. But the U.S. government and its enablers they're so practiced, like perfect at linguistic and bureaucratic gymnastics that it'll earn them the top podium at the obfuscation Olympics and get their own national anthem played. They're getting the gold medal, in other words, right? Because they'll say we don't need the AUMF. This is just a JSET. And JSETs, remember, look at our regulations that we wrote. JSETs, they're actually as much for our benefit as theirs. They're not combat missions. They're actually training missions, and they're actually for us. They're for us. we're doing like it's the inversion of like the breakup. Like it's not you, it's me. They're like, you know what I mean? Like, it's so ridiculous. Like anyway, the point is they'll say that, but of course, Green Berets are Army Special Forces who can call in an enormous. I mean, they can fight their way out of trouble because they can drop munitions everywhere. I mean, and call on.
They're essentially some of the best, as far as I know.
Absolutely, they are. Oh yeah, absolutely. And so the whole idea that this isn't a combat mission. It's like, okay, well, like they may not be going on patrol with them as advisors yet. Wait for it, but they're making the choice to train one side in an ongoing civil war / rebellion, thereby taking sides. And I'm not a fan of the insurgents of Al-Shabaab and their tactics in northern Mozambique, but I shouldn't have to say that. The bottom line is they're taking sides in it. They're making it so one side can be more effective. They're party to this conflict, and so I just don't buy this whole idea that's non-combat or not combat related. And so I think that is an interesting thing. And now you mentioned no one can find Mozambique on a map. And, like if there's Belichick rules, like do your job, then there needs to be like a Sjursen postulate. And of course, it has to be postulate because I like longer verbose words. So it's got to be postulate. But like mine would be, if you can't pronounce the country and or both find it on a map, then like you can't fight there. Like if the people aren't that informed about it. Like everyone knew how to say Berlin,
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, okay, we can at least talk about it in Congress and maybe declare war. But in the defense of the people, because I can be very exasperating and almost self-righteous or very self-righteous, part of it to me is like, we've been put in such a situation for so long in terms of how much information we have and what we're told and what we're not and what we're taught in school. Frankly, like you have to be a weirdo. And I'm including you in that. You have to be kind of a weirdo in a way in terms of your feeling connected to like distant conflicts and peoples and also just in your like intellectual curiosity to even think it wouldn't even cross most people's minds to like learn about Mozambique. And I can understand it to a certain extent, but that lack of knowledge, which is crafted over the many decades and centuries and causing the economic insecurity that keeps people focused on that, entertainment industry and social media that keeps people distracted, all these things. So it's crafted and stuff. I'm not taking all the responsibility off of all the onus off of the people, but they can almost be forgiven because the situation has been developed to create the apathy that the government needs in order to wage endless global war. Mm-hmm. One way to do it is just keep it behind the curtains and keep the people kind of like uninformed. And then it's like us, we'll talk about it, but no, they don't, they're not scared of us. Like, you know what I mean? Like the Washington, they're not scared of people like me. You're not really. I mean, they are if we get a little famous or popular, then they'll first attack our character, second ignore us if they can. If that doesn't work, then they'll jail you. But, but until then, they don't even bother with us. They don't even think of us enough. And as we know, like most relationships end in either like hatred or indifference. And we all know that indifference is worse. And that's the way they treat the weirdos who care about this.
Yeah. And I suppose it is weird, but to me, it's like I said, this is mission creep added on to the larger global war on terror. And those sorts of actions have repercussions. They might not come in 6 months or in a year or even 2 years or more, but they will come. Blowback will come. 9/11 was blowback. That doesn't excuse it, but that explains why it happened, which was a question you weren't allowed to ask at all in the days following 9/11. If you asked why, then you were on the side of the terrorists, whom still weren't really defined in any clear way. And I think there are still a lot of lingering questions about what happened that day. I'm not a truther, but I think there are a lot of lingering questions about what happened that day. And yeah, so to me, this is an extension of what we've been seeing for almost 20 years now. And that doesn't mean it's logical. It's actually more frightening than anything else. And it's like the white man colonizing the jungle again, like the savages. And to think that that's happening in the 21st century still is baffling. And I don't understand. Well, we
So
talked about the reasons, so I do understand the imperial reasons, but it's almost like, can't you see what you're doing over and over and that it's always going to be disastrous?
the thing about things like imperialism, they take on like a cultural momentum. So they may be driven largely by economic motives and like power motives, competition. After you do it a long time, you form a habit, and then a habit needs a justification, especially when it's like an immoral habit. It needs you come up with a reason, right? I mean, think about all the bad things you do in your own life. Speak for myself. Like, I mean, I know that my instinct, whether I think I'm a good guy or not, is to kind of like explain away my reasons. And so one of the ways you do that is you develop like a cultural kind of habit. And one of them is that these are savages. And so I think to a certain extent, the reason that there aren't like mass protests in the street in places like France and Portugal, although there is rising dissent in France finally, but there a lot of folks there think to themselves like, and I've read this stuff in their papers, in the translations of their papers, they'll say stuff like, serious people, essentially, look, we gave them their independence, and like it seemed like they deserve it at the time, but like look what they've done with it. They have a corrupt free limo government. Like maybe the problem is that they weren't like taking the like benefits of our white man's burden and civilizing mission. Like they don't say it quite as overtly, but there's an implication of that, and that's the cultural imperialism. And so now you mentioned blowback, like just quick because like we don't have that much more time, but I think we can not talk about the apartheid veteran mercenaries. The reason that it ties to blowback is because blowback has its macro and its micro applications. Let's just take one small one, and we're going to bracket it left and right because you could go way further back to the left in time, but local regional blowback is hitting Mozambique right now. That the Rhodesian and South African white racist regimes destabilized, impoverished further, and just wreaked havoc on the economies and populations, killing inordinate sums of people that we can't fathom, Stalin-esque sums, right? Statistical sums, from 1975 to 1991 at least, causing so much internal turmoil and just poverty and destabilization that contributes largely, not the only cause, to this bloodletting in northern Mozambique. The weak, and they're corrupt and they're problematic, but they have their reasons too. It doesn't make it okay. But the weak government in the capital is desperate and finds itself in a situation where it has to hire its rapist to protect it from future sexual assault or whatever. I mean, it sounds like a horrible, horrible and insensitive analogy, but think about it. That's what the apartheid regime did to Mozambique. It destroyed this country, and it tried to purposely. That was the goal of it. Make it like a mess that couldn't possibly provide any real support to the rebels in their countries that are fighting for, majority rule and democracy. So desperate is this weak state, problematic state, but weak state, that they, after the Russians couldn't hack it, the Russians couldn't win, turned to who? You cannot make this up. I thought I was writing fiction. The Dyke Advisory Group, DAG, a private military company, PMC, or a private military organization, PMO. There's that language again, right?
Yeah.
Modern euphemism for soldiers of fortune. But, well, why is that a problem? Well, they're headquartered in South Africa, which is a soldiers of fortune factory. That's what they do. I mean, I liked Blood Diamond well enough. Like, that's the thing, though. I mean, South Africans, Executive Outcomes was like a precursor to Blackwater. It was like this, they were all over Africa stealing diamonds and stuff,
Yeah.
For the profits from them at least. But it was founded in 2012 by, you guessed it, Lionel Dyke, who is a Rhodesian. He's like 74 years old. He's so old that in 1980, when it's a long time ago, by the way, right? Like before I was born, where you were born, right? Like he was a colonel when Rhodesia went away. during the Carter presidency, tail end of
Yeah.
that. And he's
Did
not
he
just
get did he get flown into the U.S. With the Shah for special medical treatment?
he should have, yeah. But like the whole thing is like a poisoned well of a backstory because Dyke commanded the Royal Rhodesia. He was a major at the time in the Rhodesian African Rifles Regiment, which was this really brutal infantry unit that was suppressing obviously the freedom fighters in Zimbabwe, which was then known as Rhodesia. But actually, he did cross border raids as part of that into Mozambique to attack these rebel bases, and like Mozambicans died in those raids too. It wasn't just the Zimbabwean guerrillas. Not that that would have been okay because it's a violation of obviously international law. They didn't declare war. So there's that, and it's like they're so desperate they have to call back on this guy who was like the enemy of their people, of their like race, to the extent that that's even you know what I mean? Like it's wild. But of course, this Dyke guy's a pretty savvy character. He blows with the wind, man, just like the weather. And in '85, so he stays on. He's one of these rare like white Zimbabweans who stays on. Many of them continue to own their big farms and stuff, and that's a whole other thing that went on. Prince Harry, actually, his first really serious girlfriend was a white Rhodesian, or a white Zimbabwean who stayed there. But he stays on, and he actually stays in the army, rises to the rank of full bird colonel.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's commanding Zimbabwean troops, mostly black, fighting the Renamo rebels that his former government that he worked for used to back. Because he's fighting on behalf of Zimbabwe now, which is run by Robert Mugabe, and a former African freedom fighter, rebel leader who doesn't like Renamo because they're being backed no longer by Rhodesia anymore because Rhodesia doesn't exist, but by still South Africa apartheid regime, which was already the main force behind it. So this guy's like all over the map, and he's a gem, man. Like he's old school. He's an old school mercenary. I like him. I like him. He's like I don't like Trump, but he's like the Trump of mercenaries. He's like you're gonna say bad things of mercenaries? He's like, I'm the most mercenary of them all, I mean, the website uses like really couched language and like just like surreptitious kind of coded stuff. But when he was asked after Amnesty International released a report recently last month documenting, quote, these are the things that the Dyke group, the DAG, was accused credibly, right, by many sources of doing: extrajudicial executions, shooting someone in the back of the head, firing machine guns from helicopters, and dropping hand grenades from helicopters indiscriminately into crowds of people. That's fun, right? It's like human fishing with hand grenades in Vietnam. And repeatedly firing at civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and homes. All violations of international codes of war, right? When he was asked about it, this is what cartoon villain Colonel Dyke had to say. He said, well, dissidents who ran into a hospital were shooting at us, so we shot them. It's like, all right, easy peasy, dude, right? And then he said, yeah. But he couldn't stop there. He had to go further, He had to play the real victim, because everyone knows that the real global victims, like on this planet, the true victim is the white Rhodesian, suppressor of freedom turned mercenary on behalf of blood money, right?
Yeah.
This says, though, he goes, I have no idea. Let's just hold on to that word for a second. Just take a breath. He has no idea, not even one. I have no idea why mercenaries are so badly spoken of. We have a reputation too, good or bad. I don't understand it. Like poor put upon mercenaries of the white apartheid regimes. Are you like, what kind of I wish I had that kind of confidence. I wish I had the kind of confidence. I would sleep better. I'd be happier. He has no idea why mercenaries have a bad rap. So he said that out loud in 2021.
Maybe he's just going to seed. But the bluntness of it.
That's a micro blowback, right? That's a regional blowback. So, South Africa backs these Renamo rebels, destabilizing Mozambique even further. The Mozambican one-party kind of free limo post-colonial government has its problems. It causes major issues. They have their own brutal and also incompetent security forces and under-resourced and massive poverty. And so they're so desperate they have to call in their old torturers. It's
right.
I don't understand why this isn't like the most interesting story in the New York Times.
I agree, because it's not just confined to Mozambique. It involves the I would say the entire African continent, but it also connects to what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Yemen. And it connects to what we talked about earlier in the show, the new Cold War that's been brewing for several years now since Russiagate was all the rage. And I think China, even just having like the most minimal footprint in Mozambique is enough uh, tinder to spark some kind of military adventure for the U.S. And I think because Russiagate failed, because the U.S. can't really nail down Russia, um, especially with the way it's helped rid Syria of ISIS and Islamic State, now Islamic State. They're pivoting toward China, which is arguably, I mean, not arguably, it is more powerful than Russia, at least economically, and I would argue even militarily. And I think this is a small part of that pivot. Um, it's very foolish and I think senseless, but as far as a broader narrative that it fits into, I think that's one of them at least. And then, as we talked about, the U.S. war machine is just this tautological, self-justifying monolith that is just bent on going and going because what else does the U.S. do anymore? What does it manufacture anymore?
Yeah, guns.
Yeah.
We're like a global gun dealer, and we, not inadvertently but indirectly fuel the global drug dealing, right? Like out of Afghanistan, for example. I mean, it's amazing. That's what we peddle. We peddle lies, guns, and drugs. But what's interesting about Mozambique, and I think you're so right. It's like there's a major regional component. It's a continental component. There's a broader imperial case study, like of imperialism writ large. There's a historical case study because it goes back 1500 to the year 1500. There's and look, you can't say this in the New York Times. Like you just can't write this. It's not. They would never get through the censors. But like, it is a broader critique. The story also involves. It is an unmasking of the most raw and like unvarnished realities of this hyper extractive corporate capitalism as well, multinationals. I mean, it's so overt there. It's refreshing in a way because you can look for what it is, and the whole thing unfolds, which is why I think people might read about it if good writers wrote about it, better writers than me, I sure hope. It's a 5-act play of the Shakespearean tragedy mold.
Mm-hmm.
You start with the initial colonization, and then you look into like the climax of like South African apartheid, and then and the thing is, like a lot of those Shakespearean tragedies, like I don't know, I'm not sure what the analogy is, but like Romeo and Juliet, it's not going to end well. You know what I mean? We're gonna fall on our sword in Mozambique again.
Right.
This thing's not gonna end well. It just isn't. It just isn't. Not for Mozambicans, by the way, but no one cares about them. Like even leaving them aside, it was never about them. I say it on every show, and I'm gonna say it every time I get a chance. AFRICOM's not about Africans, kids. Like stay tuned. But
Right.
I think it's important. It's a 5-act Shakespearean tragedy. That's what's happening in Mozambique, and America just wants in. We want in.
Yeah, and I think, well, it can only go one of two ways, I suppose. Things are going to escalate over there, as the parlance goes, and it's going to become something that's much more on the radars of Americans and journalists, Westerners altogether, or it's going to remain. I know it's not covert, but it's going to remain more in that covert sort of surreptitious sense where there's this far-flung conflict happening, and you might read a blurb about it here or there, but you don't really know too much, and you just hope it goes away, or you're not that interested in it. But I think the former, and I'm not inviting it, but I think the former outcome is more likely to happen, in that it's going to expand, it's going to get out of control. If we look at Africa already, it's already out of control with the Western military presence there. Um, and again, it just takes one spark to ignite a regional or even a continental or multi-continental conflict. And there just seems to be no, the same way we went into Iraq with no planning after what to do when Saddam Hussein's government fell. It's like the same thing here. Like, what is the planning? What's the point? And again, it goes back to the extraction of resources and wealth, and using this group of Muslims in northern Mozambique, this contingent, as justification, because they're terrorists. We designated them as terrorists, so they must be terrorists. And I'm not saying they aren't. As in your piece, you talk about them beheading children, and that's, to me, one of the worst things in the world you could ever possibly do. So I'm not heaping praise on them, but the answer is not to send special forces troops in there. That's only going to lead to more death and more civilian suffering. And I worry about them the most, the civilians, because they always pay the worst price in war. And
how inconvenient of you. No, really though. I'm being quick, but it's a rare thing indeed. Well, so I have to run soon, but as always, I leave you with something to think about, and then usually I go write an article about it. So stand by, listeners. I've already got it in mind. I'm looking at my scribbled notes. But there's two things that jump out at me. One relates to what you just said. We know statistically and factually that throwing military force on behalf of corrupt and largely illegitimate African proxies only destabilizes the region further, increases the authoritarianism of those governments, and actually thereby increases the number of Islamist rebel groups that we then use to justify more intervention. So the stats are borne out on that, right? When SOC Africa, Special Operations Command Africa, wrote its plan, its 2019 to 2023 plan, it wrote that in 2018. It's like the plan for how they're going to defeat extremists in Africa. Well, they've been doing a lot of work on it because they're all over more than ever. Well, the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, which is not I believe that's the organization that is affiliated with the Pentagon. I know it. They admit that when that was written in 2018, there were 9 countries in Africa with active militant Islamist groups. Not 3 years later, right? 2.5 years later, 16 countries, almost double. That's interesting. So what does it show? It shows that the military first interventions are actually worsening the problem, but we're going to keep doing it. And then the second thing I want to bring up that's something to think about, which is the legal human rights element of this and the congressional legal stuff. So there's the Leahy laws, named after the Senator Patrick Leahy, which were passed in 1998 for the first time. They've been updated several times since. And that was based on us empowering the security forces of Colombia in that drug war and the war against the FARC rebels, and they were doing all these human rights abuses. What the Leahy law says is you cannot provide training or support to they can actually designate individual units, or they can designate a whole country. You can't work with any of their security forces. And all it says in the law, there just has to be credible allegations of massive rights abuses. So they came up with this thing called it's 127. It's the 127 Echo program. And thank God for Nick Hurst. He's
great.
It's USC Title 10 127 Echo. So United States Code 127 Echo allows special operations forces to use local troops to do America's bidding, right? And what the vice director of operations for the Joint Staff says, That 127 Echo is important because it provides us, quote, viable surrogate forces designed to achieve U.S. counterterrorism objectives at relatively low cost in terms of resources and especially risk to our personnel, which is, in other words, we get other people to do our bidding and die and on our behalf. Now, by
save money.
The 127 Echo program has been immune from Leahy law oversight through both apathy on Congress's part and bureaucratic wrangling, because it falls under SOCOM and the CIA. Okay, so what we've done in a lot of cases is we've CIA-ified, we've spookified our uniformed special forces. What that does, it works with drone bases too. If it's designated a CIA drone base in Niger, like the new one, the third one they just built in northern Niger, and it doesn't fall under the same restrictions, like, for example, what Biden just did, where we have to like look over every drone strike. He wants to actually review them, supposedly, which I support, but I don't think he'll follow through or do much about it.
Right.
But the thing about these JCAT missions is they shouldn't be allowed to happen with groups that have human rights abuse allegations that are credible. But what we know from reporting is that just in 2018 and 19, there were at least 8 JCATs. There were JCATs in at least 8 countries that probably or almost definitely should have been Leahy law banned. And those include Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, Indonesia, Egypt, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Tajikistan. Well, now it's 9 because the Amnesty International report that indicted the Dyke Advisor Group specifically noted that as bad as the Dyke Advisor Group was, and throwing hand grenades into crowds from a helicopter is pretty obscene. That's cartoon villainous, right? I mean, that's like March of the Wooden Soldiers, except throwing them not at the bad guys, but at civilians in a market. The Amnesty International report said that the extrajudicial killings by the Mozambican military far outweighed those by the mercenaries. And that's not the only reports that have been written on the security forces of Mozambique fueling the insurgency through their brutality. So my point is that forget everything we just said, everybody, right? If you only heard the last 2 minutes in this episode, right there, that's enough to make this illegal, right? To make this of dubious legality and morality. I'm going to take dubious away. It makes it immoral and illegal, even by our own poorly not strict enough laws. And that's the last thing I want to leave you with. But the whole thing's absurd. And I quoted the A-Team at the beginning of the article, right? The old Mr. T show, like the beginning. The little slogan was like, if you got a problem that no one else can solve, maybe consider the A-Team. But it's like people forget that was like 83 to 87 that show ran.
I forget, but I watched it constantly.
They did a 2010 remake though.
Right.
With lovely Jessica Biel in it. And in the 2010 remake, she has a line that's in their version of the slogan. I think it's somewhere in the show. It says about the A-Team. It says, they are the best at what they do and they specialize in the ridiculous. And I ended the article by saying, well, the first part of that may be true and the second part almost certainly is. And so this whole thing's absurd. This whole thing's illegal. This whole thing's certainly immoral. It's going to end badly. And it's ridiculous, but maybe we've gotten so far through the looking glass that what these Green Berets are asked to do, their purpose has become specializing in the ridiculous. And the ridiculous, of course, is American foreign policy writ large and the society that allows it to happen. This is the social and cultural foundation that allows a society to do this for the first time in human history. First time in kind of global expansion. And I don't know, we sound hyperbolic, except that on every merit, we're correct, just in a sober analysis. That's just true.
And it's not hyperbolic. I think people would look at it as hyperbolic, as in we might be blowing this out of proportion, or again, it's so far away that it doesn't matter. But none of that is true, and 9/11 proved that. And I'm certainly not wishing or hoping for another 9/11, but if we don't pay attention to these imperial misadventures the U.S. keeps hurling itself into, something else is going to happen. It's happened multiple times throughout Europe. We've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in Spain. And like you said, it's fueled by this military imperialism in places like Mozambique. And I think that's why it's important to talk about it. And also because, normal people, civilians live there and they're suffering we're essentially funding their suffering, and
Yep.
I don't think any decent person wants a part of that. And so
Yep.
I feel obligated to talk about it, to call it out, and even if it doesn't get traction, that's I'm trying to do something. We're trying to do something. So it's, but that said, I think it's a story that anybody who's watching should definitely look at more closely and pay attention to and follow. And we'll certainly be doing that here uh, as part of our, I guess, what's becoming our AFRICOM series.
I know.
But
Put on my website, like when I get an assistant, like that's full time. And I'm not even kidding about this. I'm gonna have like this whole thing, like you know how I always say, like constantly, like keep an eye on that. Keep an eye. I say it flippantly, but I mean it. Like I'm gonna have like a whole thing, like keep an eye on spots, like and just like updates on it because this is the big. This is to me like one of. There's a whole series of them, but this is one of the main ones right now. The biggest story that you don't know about, kind of thing. You know, one of those like the biggest story that's not getting reported. It's not getting enough attention. If someone says we're hyperbolic and we're blowing out of proportion, like my response to that would be like, you're not worried enough. Like I'm
right.
like, which is like exactly what a crazy person would say. But like, you know what I mean? Like you're not concerned enough. You're not hyperbolic enough. Or you're not excited enough or blown it up enough. And, I mean, the idea, like you said, and I'll finish on this. All this goes back to the big lie that like terrorism is coming from anywhere that has Islamism locally, like local grievances that blow up into a rebellion that then takes on any sort of even vague Islamist inflection. And there's reasons why that happens, right? It's not just a Muslim thing. It's just usually religion gets thrown into these things. Like it becomes a rallying tool because it's like we need to rally around like cultural identity politics.
Right.
The myth that is going to blow back into a 9/11 has been like repeatedly debunked, but it still holds a lot of water, at least one place, which is Washington. But what's so interesting about Mozambique is it's so absurd and off the rails that the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is the 6th highest recipient of all think tanks in America of defense contractor money, and has like 8 veterans in the Biden administration, like 8 were in it. They wrote a report the day after the State Department declared ISIS CAP Mozambique. I guess that's like ISIS CAP M. After they designated them a terrorist group, a foreign terrorist organization officially for the first time, which was March 11th. I believe it's March 12th. Go to the CSIS website and they wrote a report. This is not a good think tank, right? These are not clean people. They're tainted by the war industry. They wrote a report basically saying that this whole thing is like not effective and it actually is going to hurt like humanitarian aid distribution. But they said specifically, the one thing that this does is it cuts off the ability for Americans to like send money to this organization, ISIS CAP-M. But they even say this is the 6th largest recipient of defense contractor money. And even they say there's no evidence of any American having any interaction with ISIS CAP-M. So the whole thing is a lie, and even the war industry-funded think tanks admit it. But with that, let me run. I actually am behind, and I'm going to be following up on this, and let's see what happens. But
let's stay in touch about this because I think it's a developing story. It's just getting started at this point, and we, as we've reiterated again and again, I think need to pay attention to it because it's going to get more urgent than it already is. So with that, I'd like to thank Danny Sjursen for joining me on this episode of Facts on the Ground. He is a retired U.S. Army officer, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. He writes for antiwar.com. He's a director of the new Eisenhower Media Network, or EMN, and he's the author of 2 books, Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, and Patriotic Descent, America in the Age of Endless War. And he is going to be publishing a new book in June called A True History of the United States. So keep an eye out for that. You can also listen to him on the podcast he co-hosts, Fortress on a Hill. And you can find him on Twitter at Skeptical Vet. And his website is, I have this right here, skepticalvet.com. So definitely give a look into all of that and keep with us as we stay on this story of what's happening with regard to AFRICOM and Western imperialism in Africa. Danny, thank you so much again. Oh, looks like we froze. Well, thank you all for watching. Take care.